The car wound its way through the countryside, the engine humming softly as the hills rolled by. Greg's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched in that focused way I had come to associate with him over the years. I stared out the window, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, casting the fields in hues of amber and gold. This was supposed to be a romantic getaway, a chance to rekindle what we'd lost. But so far, the silence between us only amplified how far apart we'd grown. "It's just up ahead," Greg said, breaking the quiet. His voice was flat, almost rehearsed, as if he were reading directions rather than speaking to his wife of 8 years. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything without revealing the knot of disappointment tightening in my chest. The idea of the trip had been mine, a last-ditch effort to bring us closer after months of strained conversations and unspoken resentment. Greg had agreed, though his lack of enthusiasm made it clear he was doing it out of obligation, not desire. As we pulled into the gravel driveway, my breath caught. The villa was stunning, even more beautiful than the photos on the Airbnb listing had suggested. Ivy crept up stone walls, framing large arched windows that gleamed in the evening light. A small garden filled with lavender and wildflowers bordered the cobblestone path leading to the front door. It was picturesque, almost magic, a setting plucked straight from a romance novel. Standing by the door was Alex, the host, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his jeans. He looked up as we parked, a warm smile spreading across his face. I stepped out of the car, brushing my hair back self-consciously as he approached. "Welcome," he said, his voice rich and smooth. "You must be Greg and Amy. I'm Alex." He extended a hand to Greg first, his grip firm and confident. When he turned to me, his blue eyes met mine, lingering just a second too long. "Amy," he said, his smile deepening. His handshake was steady, but there was an energy in the brief contact that sent a flicker of something unfamiliar through me. "Hi," I managed, suddenly aware of the way the evening breeze caught my hair. "I hope the drive wasn't too tiring," Alex said, stepping aside to let us into the villa. "Let me show you around." Inside, the villa was just as breathtaking as its exterior. Exposed wooden beams stretched across the high ceilings, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. Alex led us from room to room, his voice easy and engaging as he pointed out the villa's quirks and amenities. There was a fully stocked kitchen, a cozy sitting area with a stone fireplace, and a bedroom that opened onto a private balcony overlooking the hills. "You've got quite the place here," Greg said, his tone polite but detached. He was already glancing at his phone, checking emails despite his promise to leave work behind for the weekend. Alex didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he chose not to. "Thanks. It's been in my family for generations," he said. "Restoring it has been a passion project of mine." I followed Alex as he opened another door, revealing a spacious bathroom with a clawfoot tub and a modern rain shower. "And here's the bathroom. The water pressure can be a little finicky, but it's worth the wait." I nodded, running my fingers along the cool porcelain of the sink. The villa felt like a dream, a perfect escape. Yet, even as Alex spoke, my focus kept drifting to him, his relaxed posture, the way his lips curved when he smiled. He seemed so at ease, so present, a stark contrast to Greg's distracted energy. "Well," Alex said, clapping his hands together, "I'll leave you two to settle in. If you need anything, just give me a shout. My place is just down the hill." As he turned to leave, he caught my eye again, his gaze steady and unhurried. "Enjoy your stay, Amy." That evening, Greg and I sat on the patio, the hills bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. I poured us each a glass of wine, hoping to spark some semblance of connection, but Greg was already scrolling through his phone. So, I said, forcing a lightness into my voice, what do you think of the place? He glanced up briefly. It's nice, you picked well. I waited for him to elaborate, to say something more, but he was already back to his screen. The silence between us felt heavy, oppressive. I sipped my wine, trying to ignore the growing ache in my chest. As the sky darkened, a knock at the door startled me. I opened it to find Alex standing there, holding a basket. I noticed you didn't opt for the breakfast package, he said, handing it to me. Inside were fresh eggs, a loaf of crusty bread, and a small jar of honey. Thought you might appreciate some local treats. That's so thoughtful, I said, my voice warmer than I intended. His fingers brushed mine as I took the basket, and the brief contact sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. He smiled, his eyes catching the glow of the porch light. Just want to make sure my guests are comfortable. Greg appeared in the doorway behind me, his expression unreadable. What's that? Just some breakfast from Alex, I said, stepping aside. Greg gave a curt nod. Thanks, appreciate it. Alex nodded back, but his gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before he turned to leave. Good night, he said, his voice low. Good night, I replied, watching as he walked down the path. When I closed the door, Greg was already back on his phone. The next morning, Greg announced he was going for a run. Thought it'd be nice to explore the trails, he said, lacing up his shoes. Sure, I said, trying to hide my disappointment. I had imagined us spending the morning together, but as always, his priorities seemed elsewhere. After he left, the villa felt unusually quiet. I wandered into the bathroom, the steam from the shower already curling around me as I turned on the water. The hot stream cascaded over my skin, washing away the tension of the past few days. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. I had just stepped out, wrapping a towel around me, when the door creaked open. My heart leapt, and I froze. Greg? I called, but it wasn't Greg. Alec stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to something I couldn't quite place. His gaze flickered over me, lingering just long enough to send a jolt of heat through me. I thought the villa was empty, he said, his voice low and slightly breathless. I'm so sorry. My cheeks burned, and I tightened the towel around me. It's okay, I said, though my pulse was racing. Max hesitated, his eyes meeting mine. Do you like what you see? He asked, his tone teasing but weighted with something deeper. Before I could respond, he stepped back, his lips curving into a slight smile. I'll fix the lock later, he said, disappearing down the hall. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, wondering what the hell had just happened. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the closed bathroom door. My heart pounded in my chest, the rush of blood roaring in my ears. The heat of the shower still clung to my skin, but now it was mingled with an unfamiliar sensation, a fluttering, tingling awareness that left me breathless. Do you like what you see? His words echoed in my mind, the playful lilt of his voice both unnerving and thrilling. What had he meant by that? Was it just an innocent tease, a slip of the tongue? Or had it been something more deliberate, more charged? The sound of the front door opening startled me back to reality. I rushed to dress, slipping into a loose sundress and towel drying my damp hair. When I emerged from the bathroom, Greg was already back from his run, his sneakers leaving faint dirt tracks on the pristine floor. "Good run?" I asked, my voice strained as I tried to mask the chaos of my thoughts. "Yay," he replied, wiping his forehead with a towel. "The trails are incredible out here. You should try them." "I might," I said, though the idea of running through the countryside alone didn't appeal to me. The solitude of the villa was starting to feel suffocating, and I didn't trust myself to be alone with my thoughts, not after what had just happened. Later that morning, Alex stopped by again, this time carrying a tray with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He knocked lightly on the door, and when I answered, his smile was as warm and easy as ever, as though nothing unusual had transpired earlier. "Thought you two could use a little pick-me-up," he said, holding out the tray. Greg, who was seated on the couch, scrolling through his phone, glanced up. "Thanks, man. That's really thoughtful." "No problem." Alex's gaze shifted to me, his smile deepening as his eyes lingered. "How's the villa treating you so far?" "It's lovely," I replied, hoping my voice didn't betray the nerves bubbling just beneath the surface. "I'm glad," he said. There was a pause, just long enough to make me feel the weight of his presence, and then he added, "If you need anything else, just let me know." As he left, I couldn't help but watch him walk down the path, his confident stride radiating a calm assurance that Greg, for all his practicality and steadiness, seemed to lack. When I turned back, Greg had already returned to his phone, oblivious to the moment that had just passed. The day passed in a blur of forced smiles and polite conversation. Greg suggested we explore the nearby town, and though I agreed, my heart wasn't in it. The picturesque streets and quaint shops couldn't distract me from the memory of Alex's gaze, the way it had lingered just a moment too long. By the time we returned to the villa, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I excused myself to the balcony, needing a moment alone. The hills stretched out before me, their gentle curves bathed in golden light, and for a brief moment, I felt a sense of peace. Then Alex appeared. He was walking up the path toward the villa, a small basket in hand. I watched him approach, my pulse quickening despite myself. He caught my eye as he reached the door, lifting the basket slightly in a silent greeting. I hesitated, then stepped back inside. "Another delivery?" Greg asked, glancing up from his laptop. Alex smiled as I opened the door. "Just some fresh herbs from the garden. Thought you might like them for dinner." "Oh, that's kind of you," I said, taking the basket. Our fingers brushed briefly, and though I pulled away quickly, the sensation lingered. Greg stood and walked over, glancing into the basket. "Looks great, thanks." Alex nodded, his gaze flicking back to me. "I'll leave you to it. Enjoy your evening." As he turned to leave, I felt a strange pang of disappointment. I didn't understand what was happening to me, why I felt drawn to him, why his presence seemed to ignite something in me that had lain dormant for years. All I knew was that I couldn't shake the feeling no matter how hard I tried. That night, Greg fell asleep early, exhausted from his run and our trip into town. I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. I replayed the events of the day, searching for meaning in Alex's actions, in his words. "Do you like what you see?" I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Greg, and made my way to the kitchen. The villa was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, trying to calm my racing thoughts. And then I heard it, a faint knock at the door. My heart leapt as I opened it to find Alex standing there, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He held a small plate of pastries, his smile tentative but genuine. "I was up late baking," he said, his voice low. "I thought you might like these." I hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. He set the plate on the counter, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his tone gentle. I shook my head. "Just a lot on my mind." He nodded, leaning against the counter across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like a taut string. And then he said it again, his voice softer this time, almost a whisper. "Do you like what you see?" "No." The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks, my heart pounding in my chest. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I nodded. Alex's smile was slow and knowing, and for a moment, I thought he might step closer, might close the space between us. But then he straightened, his expression shifting back to something more neutral. "Good," he said, his voice light, "because I like what I see too." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving me standing in the kitchen, my heart racing and my mind spinning. I climbed back into bed, my thoughts a tangled mess. Greg stirred beside me, murmuring something unintelligible before settling back into sleep. I lay there in the dark, my heart still pounding. Alexa's words replaying in my mind. I knew I was treading dangerous waters, that whatever was happening between Alex and me was veering into territory I couldn't come back from. But even as guilt pricked at the edges of my conscience, I couldn't deny the truth. I liked what I saw. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the balcony doors. Sunlight streamed into the room, painting everything in golden hues. Greg was already gone, the spot beside me cold and untouched for hours. A note sat on his pillow. "Went for another run. Be back soon." I crumpled the note in my hand, the gesture more out of frustration than anything else. It wasn't just the early morning runs or his absent-minded demeanor. It was everything. The hollow spaces between us seemed to widen with each passing moment. He was physically here, but emotionally he felt 1,000 miles away. As I padded into the kitchen, the smell of freshly baked bread drifted through the air. My stomach growled in response, and I was surprised to find another note, this time on the counter. "Thought you might enjoy something warm this morning, Alex." Beside it sat a basket of croissants and a small jar of homemade jam. I stared at the offering for a moment, unsure of how to feel. On one hand, it was a thoughtful gesture. On the other, it was a reminder of the previous night, of words spoken in the quiet kitchen, heavy with unspoken tension. By the time Greg returned, sweaty and satisfied from his run, I was dressed and seated on the patio with a book I wasn't really reading. He greeted me with a quick peck on the cheek, his attention already turning to his phone, where another flood of emails demanded his attention. "We should check out the lake today," I suggested, desperate to salvage the day and perhaps the trip itself. "Sure," he replied, absent-mindedly, typing away. "Let me just finish this." I swallowed my disappointment and nodded, watching as he disappeared inside. The air around me felt heavy again, that familiar loneliness creeping back in. I hated feeling this way, unseen, unheard. I hated that Alex's words from the night before still echoed in my mind, louder than any of Greg's fleeting reassurances. When Alex stopped by later that morning, his easy smile was enough to momentarily lift the weight pressing on my chest. He held a small bundle of lavender tied with twine and handed it to me with a slight bow. "For the lady of the villa," he said, his voice warm and teasing. "Thank you," I murmured, my fingers brushing his as I accepted the gift. Greg emerged from the villa just then, eyeing the exchange with mild curiosity but saying nothing. Alex greeted him with the same charm he had shown me, asking if we had any plans for the day. "We were thinking about the lake," Greg said. Alex nodded. "Great choice. I can show you a good spot if you'd like." "That's okay," Greg replied, his tone polite but dismissive. "I think we'll manage." I watched Alex's smile falter for the briefest moment before he recovered, turning to me with a twinkle in his eye. "If you change your mind, let me know." The lake was beautiful, its clear waters reflecting the vibrant greens and blues of the surrounding landscape. Greg was content to sit on the shore, scrolling through his phone, while I wandered along the edge, my feet sinking into the soft, cool sand. "You seem distracted," I said, trying to sound light-hearted, but unable to keep the edge out of my voice. Greg looked up briefly, shading his eyes from the sun. "I'm just trying to stay on top of things. You know how it is." Not really. And even if I did, I was tired of competing with work, with his phone, with everything else that seemed more important than me. By the time we returned to the villa, the tension between us was palpable. Greg retreated to the couch, muttering something about catching up on emails, while I made my way to the kitchen. I was slicing vegetables for dinner when Alex appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, his voice low. I glanced over my shoulder, startled but not unhappy to see him. "No, it's fine. What's up?" He stepped inside, his presence filling the space in a way that made my heart race. "Just wanted to check if everything's okay. You seemed quiet earlier." I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I'm fine," I said finally. Alex didn't reply immediately. He leaned against the counter, his eyes searching mine. "You don't have to be fine, you know." Something in his tone made my chest tighten. I looked away, focusing on the knife in my hand. "Greg and I are just going through a rough patch, that's all." He nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. "Sometimes people need space to figure things out. And sometimes—" He trailed off, his meaning clear, even though he didn't finish the sentence. I set the knife down, my hands trembling slightly. "I should finish dinner," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex stepped closer, his movements deliberate but not threatening. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. "You deserve to be seen, Amy," he said softly. "Don't forget that." I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. His words pierced through the walls I'd built around myself, cutting straight to the heart of everything I'd been trying to ignore. Before I could respond, the sound of Greg clearing his throat shattered the moment. Alex stepped back, his expression neutral once more, as Greg entered the kitchen. "Everything okay?" Greg asked, his eyes darting between us. "Yeah," Alex said smoothly. "Just wanted to see if you needed anything." Greg nodded, seemingly satisfied, and Alex excused himself, leaving me to grapple with the chaos swirling inside me. That night, as Greg slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Alex's words played over and over in my mind. "You deserve to be seen." Did I? For the first time in years, I wasn't sure. The sun set slowly that evening, casting long shadows over the villa and bathing the hills in a soft, golden glow. I sat on the patio, staring at the horizon, trying to clear my thoughts. Greg was inside, glued to his laptop, the sound of his typing faint but persistent. It had become the soundtrack of our trip, a quiet reminder of the gulf between us. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see Alex standing there, a bottle of wine in one hand and a playful smile on his face. "Evening," he said, his voice warm. "I thought you two might enjoy this. It's from a local vineyard, one of my favorites." I hesitated, unsure if accepting his offer would be wise, but Greg appeared behind me, his tone brisk as he said, "Thanks, that's nice of you." Alex handed him the bottle but kept his gaze on me. "I'm hosting a little bonfire down the hill tonight for some other guests. Nothing fancy, just a few drinks and some music. You're both welcome to join." Greg shook his head almost immediately. "We'll probably pass. Been a long day." I glanced at Greg, then back at Alex, and before I could stop myself, the words tumbled out. "Actually, that sounds nice." Greg's brow furrowed, but he shrugged. "If you want to go, that's fine. I've got some work to finish up anyway." Alex's smile widened, his eyes glinting in the fading light. "Great. Starts in about an hour. Hope to see you there." An hour later, I found myself walking down the path toward the bonfire, the sound of laughter and faint guitar music growing louder with each step. The firelight flickered in the distance, casting a warm glow on the small group gathered around. Alex spotted me immediately, his smile as inviting as the crackling flames. "You made it," he said, stepping toward me. "I was starting to think I'd scared you off." "Not quite," I replied, my voice lighter than I felt. He handed me a glass of wine and motioned toward the fire. "Come on, let me introduce you to everyone." The group was small, just a handful of other guests, all of whom seemed friendly and relaxed. Alex moved effortlessly among them, his charm drawing everyone in. I couldn't help but notice the way his attention returned to me, though, his gaze lingering whenever our eyes met. As the evening wore on, the group began to thin out, people drifting back to their rooms one by one. I stayed, feeling an inexplicable pull to linger by the fire, where Alex now sat alone, his guitar resting on his lap. "You play?" I asked, taking a seat across from him. He strummed a few chords, his fingers moving deftly over the strings. "A little. Helps me unwind." The melody he played was soft, haunting, and it filled the quiet night with an intimacy that felt almost unbearable. I sipped my wine, watching him, the firelight dancing across his face. "You have a way of making people feel comfortable," I said, surprised by my own honesty. Alex looked up, his gaze meeting mine. "And you have a way of making people want to know you better." His words hung in the air, charged with unspoken meaning. I felt my cheeks flush, but I didn't look away. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink, the distance between us closing in ways that had nothing to do with proximity. "I should probably head back," I said finally, breaking the spell. Alex nodded, setting his guitar aside. "Let me walk you." The path back to the villa was quiet, the night air cool against my skin. Alex walked beside me, his presence both comforting and unnerving. As we reached the villa, he stopped, his hands in his pockets as he turned to face me. "I hope you're enjoying your stay," he said, his voice low. "I am," I replied, though the words felt inadequate. "Thank you for everything." His smile was faint, almost wistful. "You don't have to thank me." There was a pause, a moment of silence that stretched into something heavier. I felt his gaze on me, intense and unyielding, and my breath caught in my throat. "Good night, Amy," he said softly, stepping back. "Good night," I managed, watching as he disappeared into the darkness. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of Alex's words, his presence pressed down on me like a secret I wasn't sure I wanted to keep. Greg slept soundly beside me, oblivious to the turmoil churning inside me. I thought of Alex's smile, the way his voice dipped when he said my name, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Longing, maybe, or regret. I didn't want to feel this way, but I did, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. The next morning, I tried to push the thoughts aside to focus on the day ahead. Greg suggested we go for a drive, exploring some of the nearby vineyards, and I agreed, desperate for a distraction. But as the hours passed, the tension between us only grew. Every conversation felt strained, every silence filled with things we weren't saying. By the time we returned to the villa, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Greg retreated to the couch, his phone in hand, while I wandered onto the balcony, needing air. Alex appeared not long after, his knock on the door light but deliberate. Greg called out for me to answer, too engrossed in his work to get up. I stepped inside, finding Alex standing there with a small bundle of wildflowers. "These are for you," he said, holding them out. "Thought they might brighten your day." I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder to make sure Greg wasn't watching, then took the flowers. "Thank you." He smiled, his gaze lingering. "You're welcome." For a moment, we stood there, the space between us charged with unspoken words. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but the weight of his presence stole the words from me. "If you ever need to talk," he said finally, his voice soft, "I'm here." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, clutching the flowers like a lifeline. The morning light spilled into the villa, painting the walls in soft, muted tones. I sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring my coffee as Greg moved about, preparing for his trip into town. He had decided to pick up supplies, a task I had suggested, hoping to buy myself some time alone. The weight of everything that had happened over the past few days pressed down on me, my thoughts tangled and heavy. "I shouldn't be long," Greg said, glancing at his watch. "You sure you don't want to come?" I shook my head, forcing a smile. "I think I'll just stay here and relax." He kissed me on the cheek, a fleeting gesture that felt more habitual than heartfelt. As the door closed behind him, I exhaled, the quiet of the villa settling around me like a blanket. I wasn't alone for long. The knock on the door was soft, tentative, but I knew who it was before I even opened it. Alex stood there, his expression carefully neutral, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, concern or perhaps curiosity. "Morning," he said, his voice low. "I thought I'd check in, see how you're doing." "I'm fine," I replied, though the words felt hollow. I stepped aside, and he hesitated for a moment before entering. He lingered near the doorway, his hands tucked into his pockets. I noticed Greg heading out earlier, thought you might enjoy some company. I couldn't bring myself to tell him no. We sat in the living room, the sunlight streaming through the large windows, casting dappled shadows across the floor. Alex leaned back in the armchair, his posture relaxed, but his gaze never left mine. "Are you really fine?" he asked after a moment, his tone gentle but probing. I looked away, my fingers tightening around the coffee mug in my hands. "It's complicated." He nodded, as if he understood more than I was saying. "Complicated doesn't mean you have to go through it alone." I didn't reply. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged, until Alex leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You deserve to be happy, Amy," he said softly. "You deserve to feel alive." The words struck a chord deep within me, stirring something I had buried for so long I'd almost forgotten it existed. I met his gaze, and the intensity in his eyes made my breath catch. "I don't know if I can do this," I whispered, though I wasn't entirely sure what I meant. Alex stood, closing the distance between us in 2 measured steps. He knelt in front of me, his hands resting lightly on the arms of the chair. "You don't have to make any decisions right now," he said, "but you don't have to pretend either. Not with me." His hand brushed mine, and the warmth of his touch sent a jolt through me. I didn't pull away. The moment stretched, suspended in time. I could feel the pull between us, a magnetic force I couldn't seem to resist. Alex leaned closer, his breath warm against my skin, and for a heartbeat, the world fell away. Then his lips met mine. It was gentle at first, a tentative exploration, but the intensity grew quickly, fueled by the weeks, months, years of longing I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. His hands cupped my face, his touch firm yet tender, and I felt myself melting into him, all the walls I'd built around me crumbling in an instant. I didn't think about Greg. I didn't think about consequences or guilt or the future. All I could think about was the way Alex made me feel, seen, desired, alive. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. I pulled back, my heart racing, and Alex stepped away, his expression shifting from passion to concern. "Greg's back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex nodded, his jaw tightening. "I should go." He moved toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at me. "You're not alone, Amy. Remember that." And then he was gone. Greg entered the villa a moment later, carrying a bag of groceries. He set them on the counter, glancing at me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Quiet morning?" he asked, unpacking the bags. "Yeah, yeah, 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 yeah," I replied, my voice strained. "Quiet." I tried to busy myself with putting away the groceries, but my hands trembled, and I could feel Greg watching me. If he noticed anything unusual, he didn't say so. Instead, he turned back to his phone, the familiar sound of typing filling the space between us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a chaotic mess. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, the memory both exhilarating and terrifying. I couldn't stop thinking about Alex, about the way he made me feel, about the questions he seemed to awaken in me. Beside me, Greg slept soundly, his breathing slow and even. I turned to look at him, studying the familiar lines of his face. I wanted to feel something: love, guilt, regret. But all I felt was emptiness. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and made my way to the balcony. The night air was cool against my skin, and the stars stretched out above me in an endless expanse. I closed my eyes, letting the stillness wash over me. "You couldn't sleep either?" I turned, startled, to find Alex standing below the balcony, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said. "I was just out for a walk." I hesitated, my heart pounding. "It's fine." For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence filled only by the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then Alex stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "I meant what I said earlier," he said. "You deserve to be happy." I didn't reply, but the tears that slipped down my cheeks spoke volumes. Alex watched me for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the quiet ache in my chest. The next morning, I woke with a heavy weight in my chest. The warmth of the sun filtering through the windows was a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside me. Greg was already up, sitting on the balcony with a cup of coffee, his laptop balanced precariously on the edge of the small table. His dedication to his work was admirable once, but now it only served as a constant reminder of how far apart we had drifted. I watched him for a moment before slipping out of bed. The memory of Alex's kiss lingered, vivid and undeniable. My lips still tingled as if they remembered every second of it, every spark of energy that had passed between us. A wave of guilt surged over me, but instead of washing away my feelings, it only seemed to deepen my longing. I spent the morning in silence, moving through the villa like a ghost. Greg barely noticed. He was too wrapped up in his emails and conference calls to register the distance growing between us. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. By midday, I couldn't stand the suffocating quiet of the villa any longer. I grabbed my shoes and headed outside, letting the gravel path guide me away from the weight of my thoughts. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of lavender from the garden. I didn't have a destination in mind, but my feet seemed to know where they wanted to go. I found Alex by the barn, repairing a wooden bench that had seen better days. He looked up as I approached, his expression shifting from surprise to something softer. "Hey," he said, setting down his tools. "Didn't expect to see you out here." I needed some air," I replied, my voice barely audible. He nodded, brushing sawdust from his hands. "Fair enough. Want to sit?" I hesitated, glancing at the bench he'd been working on. "Is it sturdy?" He chuckled, the sound warm and disarming. "It won't collapse under you, if that's what you're asking." I sat down cautiously, the wood cool against my skin. Alex joined me, his presence both comforting and unnerving. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us filled with unspoken questions. "I can't stop thinking about what happened," I admitted finally, my voice trembling. But Alex's gaze softened. "Neither can I." The honesty in his words both comforted and terrified me. I looked away, my hands twisting nervously in my lap. "It's wrong, Alex, I can't—" "Then tell me to stop," he interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "If you really want me to back off, just say the word, and I will. But I don't think you want that." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He was right. I didn't want him to stop. The thought of him walking away, of the spark between us fizzling out before it had a chance to fully ignite, filled me with a sense of loss I couldn't explain. I don't know what I want, I whispered, my voice breaking. Alex reached out, his hand brushing mine. Then, then let me help you figure it out. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I returned to the villa, but my mind remained with Alex, replaying our conversation over and over. The guilt gnawed at me, but it was accompanied by something far more dangerous, an undeniable yearning that refused to be ignored. Greg noticed my distracted state during dinner. He set his fork down, his brow furrowing as he studied me. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone cautious. I forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as strained as it felt. "I'm fine, just tired." He nodded but didn't press further, returning to his plate. I watched him eat, my chest tightening with a mix of frustration and sadness. How had we ended up here, sharing a table but living in completely different worlds? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a chaotic mess. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Alex, his smile, his touch, the way he looked at me as if I were the only person who mattered. It was intoxicating, and it terrified me. Unable to bear the stillness any longer, I slipped out of bed and made my way to the kitchen. The villa was dark and silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. I poured myself a glass of water, hoping it would calm my racing thoughts. And then I heard it, a soft knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat as I set the glass down and moved toward the sound. I opened the door slowly, my breath catching as I saw Alex standing there, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low. "Then why are you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him, "Because I can't stay away." The air between us crackled with tension, the unspoken words hanging heavy around us. Alex took a step closer, his gaze locked on mine. E, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to complicate your life, but—" "You already have," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "And I let you." He reached out, his hand brushing my cheek. "Tell me to go, and I will. But if you don't—" I didn't let him finish. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us, my lips meeting his in a desperate, fiery kiss. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt alive. The kiss ended too soon, leaving me breathless and trembling. Alex rested his forehead against mine, his hands cupping my face. "I want you," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "But only if you want this too." I nodded, tears streaming down my cheeks. "I don't know what I'm doing, Alex, but I can't stop." He pressed a soft kiss to my forehead, his touch tender and reassuring. "Then don't." As he stepped back, the warmth of his presence lingered, even as he turned and disappeared into the night. I stood there for a long moment, my heart racing and my mind spinning. I was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something I couldn't fully control, and yet, for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally waking up. The morning arrived far too quickly, the pale light creeping into the room like an unwelcome guest. I had barely slept, my mind a jumbled mess of emotions and unanswered questions. Greg was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee and his laptop open in front of him. His brow furrowed as he typed, his attention glued to the screen. "Good morning," I said, my voice cracking slightly. He looked up, his expression softening. Morning. You okay? You seemed restless last night. I shrugged, avoiding his gaze. Just couldn't sleep. He nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and returned to his work. I busied myself in the kitchen, the weight of his presence pressing down on me like a physical force. The guilt was suffocating, but it was laced with something far more potent, an undeniable longing for Alex. By mid-afternoon, Greg had grown restless. "I think I'll head into town for a bit," he said, standing and stretching. "Get some fresh air and clear my head." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "That sounds like a good idea." He kissed me on the forehead, a brief perfunctory gesture, and left without another word. As the door clicked shut, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The silence of the villa wrapped around me, but it didn't bring peace, only a growing sense of unease. I wasn't alone for long. Alex appeared at the door, his knock soft but insistent. I opened it hesitantly, my heart racing as his eyes met mine. "I needed to see you," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Alex, this is dangerous," I whispered, glancing over my shoulder as if Greg might reappear at any moment. "I know," he replied, his voice low, "but I can't stay away, and I don't think you want me to." I didn't respond. The truth hung heavy between us, unspoken but undeniable. He reached out, his hand brushing mine, and the contact sent a jolt of electricity through me. I wanted to pull away, to tell him to leave, but I couldn't. My body betrayed me, leaning into his touch even as my mind screamed at me to stop. "I've been thinking about you all morning," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "I can't get you out of my head." "Alex." My voice broke, the tears welling up before I could stop them. He stepped closer, his hand cupping my cheek. "Tell me what you're feeling, Amy, please." "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel everything, and I hate it, and I love it, and I don't know what to do." He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. "Then let me show you." The sound of a car pulling into the driveway froze us both. Alex stepped back quickly, his expression shifting to one of cautious concern. "Greg's back," I said, panic rising in my chest. "I'll leave," Alex said, already moving toward the door. "But we're not finished, Amy." Before I could respond, he slipped out the back door, disappearing into the trees. I stood there, my heart racing, as Greg walked through the front door, carrying a bag of groceries. "Hey," he said, setting the bag on the counter. "Miss me?" I forced a smile, the tension in my body making it difficult to speak. "Of course." He didn't seem to notice my unease. As he unpacked the groceries, he glanced at me, his brow furrowing slightly. "You've been quiet lately. Is everything okay?" "I'm fine," I said quickly. Too quickly. Greg studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You sure? You've seemed distracted." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of the lies, the secrets, was too much to bear. I turned away, busying myself with the groceries to avoid his gaze. "But a mere way," he said, his voice firm. "What's going on?" "Nothing," I said, my hands trembling as I arranged the produce on the counter. "I'm just tired, that's all." Greg stepped closer, his presence suddenly overwhelming. "It's not nothing. I can feel it. You've been distant since we got here. Is it me? Did I do something?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell him the truth, to explain everything, but the fear of what it might do to us, to him, kept me silent. I'm fine, I said again, my voice shaking. Greg sighed, running a hand through his hair. If something's wrong, Amy, you need to tell me. I can't fix it if I don't know what it is. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. I know. He stared at me for a long moment before turning and walking toward the living room. Let me know when you're ready to talk, he said quietly. I stood in the kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the counter as tears streamed down my face. The walls of the villa felt like they were closing in, the weight of my choices threatening to crush me. I couldn't keep doing this, living two lives, caught between two men. Something had to give. And soon, the villa felt different that night, the air thick with tension that no amount of open windows or fresh breezes could dispel. Greg had retreated to the couch, his phone in hand, barely acknowledging me as I moved around the room. I could feel his growing frustration, his silent questions hanging heavy in the space between us. But it wasn't Greg's silence that unsettled me. It was Alex. I couldn't stop thinking about him, his touch, his words, the way his presence seemed to fill the empty spaces in my life. I knew I was walking a dangerous line, but every rational thought was drowned out by the memory of his lips on mine, the spark that ignited something in me I hadn't felt in years. It was late when the knock came. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat as I glanced toward Greg, who was now half asleep on the couch. I opened the door cautiously, stepping outside before anyone could see. Alex stood there, his face shadowed by the dim porch light. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity in his eyes made my knees weak. I couldn't stay away, he said, his voice low and urgent. I need to see you. I glanced over my shoulder, the sound of Greg's soft snores reassuring me that he wouldn't wake. Alex, this is too risky. You shouldn't be here. He stepped closer, his gaze locking onto mine. Do you want me to leave? I opened my mouth to say yes, to tell him to walk away and never come back, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I shook my head, my chest tightening with a mix of fear and longing. Alex reached out, his hand brushing mine. Come with me. We moved silently through the villa, slipping out the back door and into the cool night air. Alex led me to a hidden spot behind the barn, a secluded nook surrounded by trees. The stars above us were brilliant, their light casting a soft glow over his face. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us electric. Then he stepped closer, his hands cupping my face as his lips met mine in a kiss that was both tender and hungry. The world fell away, leaving only the two of us, our breaths mingling in the cool night air. Tell me this doesn't feel right, Alex murmured against my lips, his voice trembling with emotion. Tell me you don't want this. I didn't want to. I don't know what I'm doing, I whispered, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. I'm so scared, Alex. He pulled back just enough to meet my gaze, his eyes searching mine. I'm scared too, but I can't stop, not when I'm with you. His words shattered the last remnants of my resolve. I leaned into him, my hands gripping his shirt as if letting go would send me spiraling into the abyss. The kiss deepened, our bodies pressed together as the weight of our decisions faded into the background. The sound of footsteps snapped us back to reality. We froze, our breaths coming in shallow gasps as the crunch of gravel grew louder. My heart raced as I turned to Alex, panic flooding my veins. "Someone's coming," I whispered. He nodded, his hand brushing mine in a fleeting gesture of reassurance. "Go back inside. I'll handle it." I hesitated, torn between staying with him and returning to the villa. But the thought of Greg finding us, of everything unraveling in an instant, propelled me forward. I slipped through the shadows, my heart pounding in my ears as I made my way back to the villa. Greg was still asleep on the couch when I returned, his phone resting on his chest. I stood there for a moment, my body trembling with adrenaline and guilt. The enormity of what I had just done hit me like a tidal wave, threatening to drown me in its wake. I wanted to wake him, to tell him everything, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I slipped into the bedroom, closing the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, as the tears finally came. What was I doing? What had I become? But even as the guilt consumed me, I couldn't stop thinking about Alex. His touch, his words, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. I was spiraling, caught between two worlds, and I didn't know how to escape, or if I even wanted to. The morning after felt like a haze. I woke with my mind still tangled in the events of the night before. My body ached with guilt, my heart heavy with the weight of my choices. Greg was already awake, his side of the bed cold and empty. I found him on the patio, staring out at the hills with a mug of coffee in his hands. "Good morning," I said softly, trying to gauge his mood. He turned to me, his expression neutral but his eyes searching. "Morning?" The tension between us was palpable. I could feel it in the way he looked at me, as though he was trying to read the secrets I was so desperately trying to hide. I forced a smile, sitting across from him as the quiet morning air enveloped us. Later that day, while Greg showered, I wandered into the living room, my thoughts scattered. That's when I saw it. A piece of paper sticking out of his bag. It was folded neatly, the edges slightly worn, as though it had been opened and closed multiple times. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled it out and unfolded it, my breath catching as I recognized Alex's handwriting. Last night was unforgettable. I need to see you again. I can't stop thinking about you. Meet me tonight. Same place." Yeah. The room spun as the implications of the note sank in. My stomach twisted into knots, my heart hammering in my chest. How had Greg found this? How long had he known? I glanced toward the bathroom, the sound of running water filling the air, and panic surged through me. I shoved the note back into his bag, my hands trembling. What was I supposed to do? Confront him? Pretend I hadn't seen it? The walls felt like they were closing in, and I struggled to catch my breath. Greg didn't mention the note, not at breakfast, not during our walk through the garden, not even as we sat on the patio that evening. But I could feel the shift in him, the way his eyes lingered on me, the careful tone of his voice. It was as though he was waiting for me to confess, to admit what he already knew. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was unbearable, the weight of the unspoken truth crushing me. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the stone patio. "I need to get some air," I said, avoiding his gaze. Greg didn't stop me. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. I wandered aimlessly, my feet carrying me down the path toward the barn. The night was cool. The stars scattered across the sky like tiny pinpricks of light. My mind raced with possibilities. Did Greg suspect Alex? Did he know everything? Or was he still piecing it together? I didn't have to wonder for long. As I rounded the corner of the barn, I froze. Greg stood there, his back to me, his posture tense, and in front of him was Alex. The sight of them together sent a jolt of fear through me. My first instinct was to turn and run, but something held me in place. I stepped closer, keeping to the shadows, straining to hear their conversation. "You're a bold man, showing up here like this," Greg said, his voice low and controlled. Alex didn't flinch. "I'm here because I care about her." Greg let out a humorous laugh. "Care about her? Is that what you call sneaking around behind my back? Do you even know what you've done to her? To us?" "She's not happy, Greg," Alex said, his tone steady, "and you know it." Greg took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "And you think you can fix that? By what? Seducing her? Breaking up a marriage?" "I didn't plan for this to happen," Alex replied, "but I won't apologize for how it feels. Amy deserves to be with someone who sees her, who makes her feel alive." Greg's laugh was sharp, cutting through the quiet night. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing but a distraction. A fantasy." The words hit me like a slap. I wanted to step in, to defend myself, but fear kept me rooted in place. I watched as Alex held his ground, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe I am," Alex said quietly, "but at least I make her feel something." The tension between them crackled like a live wire, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it exploded. Greg's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. "She's my wife, Alex, not yours. Whatever you think is happening here, it's over. You stay away from her." Alex didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "That's not your decision to make." Greg lunged forward, grabbing Alex by the collar. "Listen to me," he hissed. "You're going to leave. Tonight. And you're not coming back." Alex didn't fight back. He stood still, his gaze steady as he met Greg's anger head on. "If that's what Amy wants, I'll leave. But you don't speak for her." The sound of my name startled me, snapping me out of my paralysis. I stepped out of the shadows, my voice trembling as I said, "Stop, both of you." They turned to me, their faces reflecting a mix of shock and anger. Greg released Alex, his hands falling to his sides as he took a step back. Greg said, his voice softer now. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer right away. My heart pounded as I looked between them, my emotions a whirlwind of guilt, fear, and something I couldn't quite name. "I can't do this anymore," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine. It's not." Greg's expression shifted, a mix of hurt and confusion flashing across his face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't know what I want," I admitted, tears streaming down my cheeks. "But I can't keep living like this." Alex stepped forward, his hand reaching for mine. "Amy?" "No," I said, pulling away. "I need time to think, to figure out what I want, alone." Oh, mm. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Greg's jaw tightened, but he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Alex's face fell, but he didn't argue. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I need to do this for me." And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving both of them behind. The path back to the villa felt endless, the weight of my decision pressing down on me with every step. For the first time in years, I was truly alone. And while it terrified me, it also felt like the only way forward. The villa felt hollow without the tension that had filled its walls for days. I woke to the quiet hum of the countryside, a sound that once felt peaceful but now only amplified the void inside me. Greg's side of the bed was empty. He had left early, just as he said he would. His absence wasn't abrupt or dramatic. It was quiet, like the closing of a book neither of us had finished reading. He had slipped a note under my coffee mug before leaving. "Amy, I hope this time apart helps us both. If you ever want to talk, you know how to reach me. Take care of yourself." I read it several times, but the words didn't change. They didn't carry anger or resentment, just the heavy finality of two people who had run out of ways to fix something broken. The day passed in a daze. I wandered from room to room, unable to focus on anything for long. The villa, which had once felt like a retreat from the world, now seemed to echo with reminders of choices I couldn't take back. I couldn't stop thinking about Alex. His words, his touch, the way he looked at me like I was something he couldn't live without. It was all there, playing on a loop in my mind. But now, in the harsh light of reality, those moments felt more like stolen whispers than the promises of a new beginning. I sat on the balcony as the sun dipped below the horizon, clutching a blanket around my shoulders. The hills rolled out before me, bathed in the golden glow of twilight, but I couldn't find the beauty in them anymore. My mind kept circling back to the question I'd been avoiding for days. What now? When the knock came, I wasn't surprised. I knew it would be Alex. He stood in the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, his expression somewhere between cautious and hopeful. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Hey." He lingered by the door, his eyes searching mine. I heard Greg left. I nodded, wrapping the blanket tighter around myself. "He did, this morning." Alex hesitated, as if choosing his next words carefully. "And you? How are you holding up?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I feel lost, like I don't know who I am anymore." He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "You're not lost, Amy. You're just figuring things out." "I don't know if I can," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know how." Alex reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. But you don't have to do it alone either." For a moment, I let myself sink into the comfort of his presence, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. But then I pulled back, the weight of everything crashing down on me. "Alex," I began, my voice breaking. "I can't jump from one life to another. I need time to figure out who I am without Greg, without anyone." He nodded slowly, his face falling but his voice gentle. "I understand, and I'll wait, if that's what you need, as long as it takes." His words hit me like a wave, both comforting and suffocating. I wanted to believe in the possibility of something with him, but I knew I couldn't make that promise. Not now. "I don't know what the future holds," I said, "but I need to do this on my own." Alex's eyes searched mine, and for a moment I thought he might argue, but then he nodded, stepping back toward the door. "You deserve to find your happiness, Amy, whatever that looks like." "Thank you," I whispered, tears spilling down my cheeks as he turned and walked away. That night, I sat on the balcony again, the stars above me bright and endless. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to simply be, without guilt, without fear, without the weight of anyone else's expectations. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know where I was going or what would come next, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep living my life for others. I had to start living it for me. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough